Hey everyone, and welcome to today's Explainer. Today, we're diving into the really fascinating journey of a specific web framework that beautifully illustrates a massive shift happening right now in modern software development. We're going to explore how an absolutely capable, highly engineered piece of open source software can just be brought to its knees. And not by bad code either, but by the incredibly complex intersection of human behavior and international law.
Right. So this is the story of a technological marvel. It was this elegant, robust solution to web development that ultimately collided with the grueling realities of internet community dynamics and, well, brand new global compliance laws. It's a story that really highlights the shifting, kind of scary landscape of independent development in an increasingly regulated digital world.
Okay, let's dive into this. Section 1. Meet Pakai Server. So this framework, specifically version 6.99, was meticulously crafted by a developer named Poon Yip Hoon, who goes by Aeric. Now, it was designed as a full-stack project template for B4J, which is a rapid application development tool for Java. But its true magic? That lay in how it handled the web. Instead of relying on heavy client-side rendering with those massive JavaScript frameworks we're all used to, Pakai Server generated all of its HTML server-side using B4X code. It literally bypassed the need for custom JavaScript altogether. For a developer, this meant a dramatically simplified experience. You write a logic on the server, and the framework just takes care of cleanly delivering it to the browser.
Moving right along, Section 2, the modern tech stack.
To really appreciate what was lost here, we have to look under the hood. The technical architecture was nothing short of impressive. And this brilliantly illustrates the sheer flexibility Aeric built into the system. You see, when a developer started a new project, they weren't forced into this one-size-fits-all box. The framework offered 3 versatile modular deployment variants. You could deploy a full-stack variant that came with 15 modules covering a web UI, a REST API, and full documentation. But if you just needed a backend, you could spin up the API-only variant with 9 modules. Or if you just wanted the user interface, you could use the web-only variant with its 11 modules.
Let's look at the next piece of this puzzle, because this builds into a remarkably modern toolset. Pakai Server utilized HTMX version 2.0.8 to handle dynamic front-end interactions, and again, without forcing you to write custom JavaScript. It used Bootstrap 5.3.8 for a super clean, responsive user interface, and AlpineJS 3.15.8 to power this really interactive API console. On the back end, it didn't lock you in. It offered flexible, compile-time switching between SQLite, MySQL, and MariaDB. Honestly, building web apps with this stack was incredibly streamlined.
But perhaps the biggest time saver, the real game changer here, was the documentation. Pakai Server included this Web API utils integration that automatically generated OpenAPI 3.0 documentation and an interactive Swagger UI right out of the box. It even generated live B4X code snippets for every single API endpoint. You just build your API, and the documentation practically writes itself. That is a massive achievement for an independent developer.
So what does this all mean? If it was so capable, so flexible, and such a huge time saver, what went wrong? How did a project with so much technical merit suddenly hit a brick wall? Well, to understand that, we actually have to drop the technical specs for a minute and look at the inciting incident that completely disrupted the project. Which brings us to Section 3, the vulnerability conflict. We enter a space here where hobbyist open-source development crashes headfirst into strict, emerging government tech regulations. The whole clash started on the project's forum. A user from Europe, going by the name Hatsian, raised a very real, very pressing concern. They pointed out that starting this summer, European developers are subject to the new Cyber Resilience Act. Under this new EU regulation, developers are strictly prohibited from posting any application that contains known vulnerabilities, and the financial penalties for doing so, as the user noted, they are completely devastating. So, the specific technical conflict boiled down to database drivers. Pakai Server, out of the box, shipped with older JDBC drivers for SQLite and MariaDB, specifically versions 3.7.2 and 3.5.6. The problem? These older versions had documented known vulnerabilities. So for a European user, this meant the framework's default state was a massive legal compliance risk. They actually provided a list of updated safe drivers, like SQLite 3.5.3.2 and MariaDB 3.5.9, that absolutely needed to be swapped in to keep European users legally safe. Let's look at the other side of this. Section 4, Open Source Realities.
This brings us to a really fascinating crossroads. The user's concern, completely valid.
but shifting focus to the developer reveals the heavy burden placed on unpaid, independent maintainers. Aeric responded by defending the architecture of the project. He pointed out that the older drivers are shipped with the core B4J language by default, which is what makes the framework function instantly when a new user downloads it. He argued that for local development and testing behind a firewall, these drivers are perfectly safe. Actually, scratch that. It goes deeper. Because Pakai Server is released under the highly permissive MIT license, Aeric noted that any developer putting a project into actual public production has the full freedom and frankly the responsibility to upgrade those third-party dependencies to newer, secure versions themselves.
So the crucial point is what Aeric said next. He used this specific conflict to highlight a much larger systemic issue. He made a passionate plea about community participation. He explained that in the open source world, if users just download code and stay silent, it slowly kills the project. The GitHub algorithm is ruthless. If a project has no forks, no issue reports, and no stars, it just fades into obscurity. The burden of maintaining compliance, updating drivers, and building features, it simply cannot rest on one unpaid developer while the community quietly consumes the product.
And that leads us to Section 5, the end of an era.
This combination, the looming threat of international legal fines on one hand, and the sheer exhaustion of maintaining a complex framework for a silent audience on the other, it brings us to a pretty bittersweet resolution. Despite Pakai Server being born with a noble cause, to rival major frameworks within its specific programming ecosystem, Aeric had to face reality. He stated openly that he felt the project was getting less interest among the community. The mounting pressures of compliance, the lack of active engagement, and just the sheer effort required to maintain the whole shebang, it forced his hand. He officially announced his decision to end new development on the project.
And so, version 6.99 marks the absolute final release. What we're left with is the legacy of a highly capable, beautifully architected, and incredibly useful tool that has, unfortunately, been abandoned. Now, it's still going to remain available as open source, but the active journey, that has come to an end.
Which leaves us with a really critical question to ponder. We all benefit from open source software, right? But in an increasingly regulated digital world with massive new frameworks like the Cyber Resilience Act, how will independent, hobbyist open source projects adapt? When strict legal compliance intersects with community apathy, are we going to see more brilliant frameworks like Pakai Server simply shut their doors? It's a fragile ecosystem for sure, and its future really depends on how we choose to participate in it. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer. I really hope it gave you something to think about today.